We're ready for this one?
Always.
Today, we are diving into Genesis chapter 16.
Yeah.
Which is, well, we always say this, but this is a story that's thousands of years old.
Right.
But it just feels so relevant even today. We're going to be talking about Avram, Sarai, and Hagar. And, this whole story about impatience.
Yeah.
Societal pressures, and just how the choices we make even thousands of years ago can still have these ripple effects that we're feeling today.
Yeah, this chapter is so interesting because it doesn't shy away from showing how messy human nature can be. Even when we're talking about, people who are considered, chosen by God.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's really important for us to remember as we kind of dive into this.
Yeah.
We're 10 years into God's promise to Avram, right? He's been promised descendants as countless as the stars. And yet here we are 10 years later and Sarai is still childless.
Yeah. And 10 years, that's a long time. Especially, thinking about the societal pressures of that era.
Yeah.
Like you can just feel Sarai's desperation.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's where things get really, complicated.
Yeah.
She offers up Hagar, her maidservant, as a surrogate to Avram.
Right. And it's so easy for us to sit here, thousands of years later and look back and judge.
Oh, yeah.
But we have to remember, this was a completely normal practice back then. It doesn't seem as strange or unusual. But I think what makes it so interesting in this context is that we know God's already made a promise.
Hey, Dad.
So it's where does that leave? It makes you question, did Avram really believe that God was going to come through?
It's like he's trying to, I don't know, help God out,
right?
Speed up the timeline.
Exactly.
But I got this.
Yeah, I got this, God. I'm gonna give you a hand here.
Yeah, and that's what always gets me. It's like, here's Avram, chosen by God,
right?
And he stumbles. What does that tell us about human nature? Even when we think we're totally in line with this divine plan.
Right. Well, and I think that's just it. We're human, and doubt and impatience, those are things that we all struggle with.
Yeah.
Even when we have faith.
Right.
I think Avram's lapse here wasn't just about cultural norms. It was about a crisis of faith.
Wow.
He let fear and societal pressure overshadow this incredible promise that he had been given.
And that's when those ripple effects start.
Right.
Because it's not just Avram's faith that's impacted at this point. It's the entire dynamic between him and Sarai and Hagar.
Absolutely. It's everything starts to unravel. Things get really, really messy.
So paint us a picture. What happens?
So Hagar, she becomes pregnant.
Right.
And it's all of a sudden, all these emotions, all this tension just explodes. Hagar, she starts to look down on Sarai.
Wow.
And Sarai, she becomes incredibly harsh towards Hagar.
It's just heartbreaking.
It's a bad situation all around.
Yeah. And you could just imagine, right? Put yourself in Hagar's shoes for a second.
Right.
Pregnant, probably feeling very used, and now being abused on top of it all.
She's alone. She's scared.
It's no wonder that she wants to escape.
Yeah.
And that's what she does, right? She flees into the wilderness.
Just trying to get away.
It's just, you can almost picture it, right? This desperate attempt to find some kind of relief.
Absolutely. And you would think, right, that with everything that's happened, this is where God would step in.
Yeah, some dramatic rescue.
Right.
Stop everything. This is wrong.
Yeah, and this is what I love about this story. It's not quite that straightforward.
Okay, so walk us through this.
So Hagar's in the wilderness, right?
Yeah.
And an angel of God finds her.
Okay.
And this is the part that really makes you think, because what does the angel tell her? To go back.
To go back.
To Sarai.
Yes, to go back to Sarai and submit to her. See, that's where I always struggle a little bit, because on the one hand, you have this message of, obedience and submission.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's where's the justice?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that this isn't about God condoning Sarai's actions.
Okay.
It's about him working within this incredibly complex and honestly really messed up situation.
So how do we make sense of that then?
Well, let's try looking at it from Hagar's perspective. She's at her absolute lowest point, right?
Yeah.
Completely alone, feeling completely hopeless.
Yeah.
And suddenly, here is a divine messenger, not only acknowledging her pain and her suffering, but also offering her something incredible, a promise.
And that promise is?
That she will bear a son.
Ishmael.
Yes, Ishmael. And not just any son, right?
Right, because his descendants, they're going to be too numerous to count, right?
Exactly. So even in the midst of all this adversity, God is working his plan, offering hope and a future that extends far beyond what Hagar can even imagine at that moment.
Wow. Okay, so like huge promise,
Right.
but there's a catch, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not all sunshine and roses from here on out.
Sadly, no, it's not.
What else does the angel tell Hagar?
Well, the angel tells her that Ishmael will be, and this is powerful imagery, a wild donkey of a man.
Oh, wow.
His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him.
Okay, so there's this sense of conflict, of being an outsider.
Yes, and I think it's important to note here that many of our sources point out that Muslims trace their lineage back to Ishmael.
Right, this isn't just some ancient story, it's still relevant today.
Exactly. It's a direct link from this moment of conflict and hardship to a major world religion.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it that way.
And it really highlights how those ripples, those consequences of choices made thousands of years ago,
Yeah.
they're still being felt today.
It's a lot to process, you
It
know?
really is.
It's like this one chapter, Genesis 16, it's like this microcosm of, human nature and how messy face can be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it makes you think, if Avram and Sarai, these people who are supposed to be like chosen by God, if they struggle with, trusting God's timing,
Right.
what does that mean for us?
It's a question we all grapple with, right?
Generally.
Like, we see that same pull, that same temptation to take matters into our own hands.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Whether it's societal pressures or just, our own impatience. It's so easy to try and force things.
It's like we think we know better than,
Right. Than
God, basically.
Yeah, and I think what Hagar's story reminds us is that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do
Yeah.
is surrender.
Ugh, that's the hard part.
It's so hard, especially when things feel uncertain or, when we're hurting, when things feel unfair.
Totally.
But there's something really profound about that idea of like letting go of control and trusting that God is working even when we can't see it, even when it doesn't make sense.
It's that whole, God's working in mysterious ways thing.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes those mysterious ways, they lead to something extraordinary.
Yeah, like with Hagar's son.
Exactly. Through Ishmael, a whole lineage continues. A people group is formed.
That God's promise wasn't limited by their mistakes.
Not at all. And I think that's a really hopeful message.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, no matter how badly we mess things up,
Right.
God can still bring about his purposes.
So this whole deep dive, it's really been about these ripple effects, right? The choices that we make and how they impact not only ourselves, but, the people around us.
Yeah, not just the people around us, but like generations to come.
Totally. So for someone listening to this right now, thousands of years after the story went down, like, what do you think is the most important thing for them to take away from all of this?
When I think about Genesis 16, my mind always goes back to that moment when the angel finds Hagar. She's alone, she's scared, she probably feels totally abandoned.
Yeah.
And yet she's seen, she's known, and she's given this incredible promise.
That's powerful.
It is, and I think it speaks volumes about the nature of faith.
How so?
Well, it's not about having all the answers.
That's
It's not
right.
about forcing outcomes or having, this perfect, Instagrammable spiritual life.
Right.
It's about trusting
Trusting that.
even when we can't see it, even when we don't understand, we are held by something so much bigger than ourselves.
Wow. Yeah, that's beautifully put.
Thank you.
It's like these ancient stories, these stories about,
Yeah.
flawed people and this incredible God, they still matter.
They do.
They can still, challenge us and inspire us and maybe even guide us.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's in those moments of, wrestling with doubt, wrestling with the hard questions, that we discover the deepest truth about ourselves and about God.
I love that. That's a great place to wrap things up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for diving into this with me today.
Of course. Always a pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Genesis chapter 16. We hope this sparked some, reflection, maybe even some hope for you
Definitely.
as you're, navigating the ups and downs of life and faith.
Keep seeking.
Until next time.